The reading today centered on feminist curatorship, and there are some, we could say, parallels between feminist curatorship and indigenous curatorship, not only in the time period of their emergence, but facing similar dilemmas. One of the primary differences, though, will be the presence of, we'll say, women in museums as compared to indigenous peoples in museums. There actually, for a longer period of time, have been more women in museums in curatorial roles. And before we go into this, I need to tell you that on Wednesday, due to a doctor's and dentist appointment with my sweetheart, I'm not going to be here. So you're going to be doing research on your honor in the library related to your semester project. I'll send you specific guidelines tonight of what I expect you to uncover as we are building little bit by little bit this body of information that you'll be using in your hypothetical exhibit. So for Wednesday, once again, you'll be in the library until 4 o'clock. And you'll be expected to sign in when you get there. Now, feminism is kind of a misconstrued, very often misconstrued label, particularly in the 70s and 80s, because there were several sets of stereotypes that went along with someone being a feminist. And it's actually, it's a sad statement about culture when we even have to use that type of term to distinguish the emergence of a way of thinking. For example, if we were to look at just the society from which I come, my tribe, and for that matter, the tribes that I'm related to, were matrilineal and still are. In anthropology, what matrilineal means is that you get your clan through the woman's side of the family. So I'm a Wolf clan because my mother's Wolf clan. And her brother is Wolf clan because their mother was Wolf clan. So the clan runs through the mother. And we were also called matrilocal, which meant that when we got married, the man in the old days would go and live with his mother-in-law's family, and his labor became her property. That makes pretty darn good sense. And you hear this term, have you ever heard someone say the battle of the sexes? The way we like to refer to it is the balance of the sexes. Because there were gender roles that were entailed in being male or female. And they were not, one was not valued at the expense of another. They were very important, held equally important. And so it's really, it's a sad statement when we're looking at Western society, which we could say is patrilocal, patrilineal, patriarchy. All right, and patriarchy means rule by men. Patrilocal means you go and live with your father's family, and patrilineal means the bloodline goes through the father. Most tribes in this hemisphere were matrilineal until they were Christianized. And that shifted a lot of focus economically, culturally, and spiritually. And you'll find, and I'm making this on a really big picture when we're looking at culture as the way it relates to spirituality too, because in societies that were very strongly matrilineal and they converted to Christianity, they had difficulty accepting what they call the Trinity. Father, Son, and in the old days it was called the Holy Ghost. Had difficulty with that. And so you find in many of these societies, they found a way to be able to make that a balance. And what they did is they made Jesus' mom, the Virgin Mary, as potent and even more potent a spiritual figure. That's why Guadalupe is so important in Mexico. That's why Gatali, the Gacuita, the lily of the Mohawks, who was just turned into a saint up in the Northeast. You know, they needed to have a strong woman figure in their theology in order to be able to accept Christianity. So this notion that we actually have to set aside a category called feminism really reflects a long process, a long set of historical and cultural ideas in Western museum institutions. And as professionals, if you go into museums outside of your own pueblos, reservations, reserves, that you'll find that if you're working in a non-native institution, you're still going to find many institutions, they're going to have a lot of women there, but are dominated by male power. And feminism itself then was this emergence in academia, but in other areas too, because it occurred in sports, it occurred in art, and particularly in history. And it was often seen as what was called a revisionist. You know, like, and that term in the older time was used as a kind of a diminutive term. Like, diminutive mean, you kind of say it, almost making fun of. When really what it was is an attempt to fill out another side of history and add voices that were there but had never been listened to or heard, and at times even expressed, based on a patriarchal society. So when we look at feminism as being this collection of movements and ideologies, and ideology in essence is a way of thinking, all right, a way of intellectualizing what we do, that would define, to establish, and defend equal, not only political, but economic and social rights for women. Now, even to 2013, men make, for this, doing the exact same job, on average, make 20% more in salary than women do in the workforce. For the same job. And when we look as a way that it is a part of language even, that, have you ever heard someone say a lady cop instead of just a police officer? Or a lady judge? In offices that are commonly thought of as being male-dominated, they'll use that other term and are distinguished that this is different than the norm. This really acknowledges a power sequence. So even in the way that we look at language and power, and this differentiation, and feminists often had very negative connotations to it. That this is the kind of stereotype that you would hear in the 1970s. If someone was a feminist, then they never shaved their legs or their armpits. You know what? You shouldn't. It's bad for you. Your hair's there for a reason. It's to protect you. But in a society that is tailored to suit the gaze of men, there is a strong social pressure. Not to have gray hair. One of the most common body modifications now for women is what? Yes, breast implants. If you're contemplating it, don't. They're bad for you. What does it really benefit you to have your breasts stand an inch larger and look like they're inflated with helium? To make you look like a comic book character. Really? Why are you doing this? Because of male sense of aesthetic. A lot of this body modification that occurs for women, they think is to beautify themselves, but for who? The next is hair removal. Don't do it. When we engage in that type of stuff, we are buying into a larger set of aesthetic that has been defined by men. Because the men who run the cosmetic industries, it is what they're putting out there. The men who run the fashion industries, it's what they're putting out there. This is not just the world according to Steve. Pay attention to who owns major corporations in cosmetics, fashion, and the like. Advertising. So this notion that women who were feminists didn't shave their arms or legs or their armpits or other places. They burned their bras. Because this was one of the ways of calling public attention to these issues in the 1970s. I was at a bra burning. It really stunk. Because there's all this latex and cloth burning. I mean, there was this black smoke coming up. It definitely got your attention. Right? So that's one of the stereotypes. There's stereotypes about someone's sexuality, their sexual orientation, if they're a feminist. There are so many stereotypes. And really, all it is saying, hey, we're human beings. We're not the opposite sex. We're the other sex. That's it. And in many ways, this is why I want to go back to Mary, or even a mythology, because it has a long-standing tradition in the Old Testament. The Old Testament that was adopted by Islam, as well as the New Testament. And the Old Testament begins where? What's that? Genesis. Yes, Genesis. And Genesis tells you a story. Adam and Eve. Have you ever heard the story of Adam and Eve? It's a really cool story because it really gives you a mindset, a pathos. Because they are living in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is this amazing place. By the way, humans were immortal at this time. They would live forever. All they had to do was make sure, and they didn't have any clothes, they didn't need them. All they had to do was make sure is that they didn't eat from this one tree. The fruit from one tree. Now, as it got converted later on, it became an apple that was taken from the tree. The apple wasn't the original fruit. There's no fruit named in Genesis. It became an apple because the apple, if you cut it, it has a 5-pointed star. And that was equated with witchcraft. And there were huge burnings of women during the Dark Ages. Who were the witches in Europe? And the symbol of witchcraft is a pentangle. Cut that apple in half and look at it. It's a pentangle. It's got 5 lobes. Now, everything was really cool in the Garden of Eden. There were microwave dinners just hanging from every tree. No one had to cook. And they cooked themselves. All right? There were PlayStations, Xboxes, everything you wanted there. Computers. This is definitely a man's Garden of Eden, all right? But the woman's Garden of Eden would have, just amazing stuff. Everything was great. Everything was great. And Adam was just sitting home one day, and, Eve comes home, and damn, if she didn't listen to some snake that said, come here, psst, come here. Everything was fine. And the snake told her to take a bite off of this. And the reason that she wasn't supposed to have this is because this is what gave God his power. And so, she bites it, and snake convinces her to go give it to Adam. Everything was fine. All right, everyone was living forever, but no, you women had to mess it up. Everything was great, but no, you just couldn't mind your own damn business. You had to listen to some damn snake. All right, you messed it up for everybody, because as soon as Adam bit into that apple, God was up there with his whistle, and he went, "Bah! Everybody out of the pool. All right, you're all going to die now, and women, you have the curse." And it's come to you every month to remind you of your original sin. And you're going to spend the rest of your life erasing a blackboard that has cuss words on it, and every time you erase one, it's going to reappear. When you look at cultures that value men over women, you're going to find it as part of their mythology. And it will not only be in the spiritual beliefs, it will be in the political, governmental, and economic institutions. So it's a really big issue that you're going out into, because it's not just the workplace. It is a part of a mindset that has been part of someone's enculturation, the way they learn their culture. So while it has been developing as a political voice since the 1970s, that's only in this century, the later century, when it was heard. Because even in this country, until the 1920s, I can't remember, I think it was 1924, 22 or 24, because one of the years was when Indians got citizenship, and the other one is what they called Women's Suffrage Act. What did that mean? Women got the right to vote. You know, in the United States Constitution, women are considered chattel, and that's what that amendment did. Chattel is walking, talking property who cannot own property and cannot vote. Women were grouped as 3/5 of a human being. A black man had more rights than a white woman. A black woman had less rights than everyone. That's why when John Lennon sang the song, "Woman is the nigger of the world," it really made a lot of people uncomfortable. For one, he used the N-word, and he equated the N-word, which is a very, very negative term, with the life that women had to lead. Very controversial song. And by the way, today's Yoko Ono's 80th birthday. And they sang it together on Dick Clark. Or was it not Dick Clark, Dick Cavett. I remember the show. So it was kind of ironic. But I remember when they sang that song, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is intense. He's going to get he's used to getting a lot of crap for what he was saying. He's the same one who said, the Beatles are as popular as Christ. But when we're looking at this, it's very, very pronounced across industries. So suffrage in the 1920s was the you might say it was the end stop of a long process that was set in motion in the 19th century by women activists in New York State. And those women activists, by the way, were looking at societies where women were valued. They were looking at my people, my relatives, and saying, why is it that we don't have the same types of rights? They were right in Seneca country, Mohawk country, and they were referring to American Indian women. And then when we see the feminist movement emerging, then that is the tail end of another set of events. Because what occurs, you're getting a little bit of world history here. And it's important to understand this because when we're looking at women's place in the workplace, that by the 1970s, a lot of the changes that had been, in many ways, World War I and II changed the status of women and then disrupted it. Because in World War I, that when women had to leave the home to go work in the factories because men were at war, it gave women economic clout. When the men came back, the women were kicked back out of the factories. World War II, the same thing happened. Women were working in the factories. That's why if you look in, just look up Rosie the Riveter. That was a poster of a woman holding a rivet gun. She's got a bandana on her head. She's working in a factory to build the war machine. She was getting paid to do that, earning a wage outside of the home. Because the stereotypical role of women in the United States is you stay home and you have babies. You don't work. And in my generation, I still remember parents saying, a woman's place is in the home. And that if a woman went to work, it was only part-time. But what started to happen in the 60s and the 70s is more women started to enter the workforce. More women started to become economically independent. More women started to go to college. Right now, there are more women in college than there are men. And what we see in this classroom, in many ways, is indicative of what we see in many museums, too. You got 2 men and 5 women. With education comes power. And what also started to happen, once women started getting education, if you look at correlations, which are things that occur together, the divorce rate goes up. Why? Yeah. Women have the economic power now. They're not reliant on their husband. And if they get a divorce, and then you start to hear, and it's so important to be aware of language. If you ever hear someone say, I'm a single mother, in a very loving way, say, you're a mother. That's the important role. You're a mother. Because often when that is said, it's to set someone apart from. So being aware of how language in very invisible ways can affect the way that we view ourselves and the way we view others. So as these, and this is part of ideology, the way we think and how the way we think is expressed through our language, the way we describe ourselves and the way we describe others. And then the indirect presence, be it in art exhibits and museums. Now, if you study art history, and I think I mentioned this in the beginning of the semester, if you look at a Gardner's art text or Jansen's art text, and then when I was in college, there were very, very few women artists in that textbook. And the ones that were featured were the ones, I mentioned this, I'm sure in here, they had to go to Europe to get recognized. And I mentioned the Impressionist painter, Marie Cassatt. She had to go to France in order to be recognized as a painter, because there was this notion that women do craft. They're good with their hands and they do craft. They do dainty things, things for the home. Men create art. So this notion of balance versus battle, that an important issue today in feminist curatorial practice is not to denigrate or downplay the importance of men in art. It's undeniable. The challenge is to make it balanced so that we understand the role of women in art as artists and as curators. So there's often there is this desire when, in early exhibits in particular, and it was important in order to bring attention to the contributions of women as artists. And they call it being polemic. Polemic means that you're showing things in extremes. And often they may even seem against each other, like men against. All right, and so sometimes this could be an important way of bringing an exhibit to national attention, is that it's just women, and it's just women who are focusing on this particular theme, and men are excluded, and there is this is part of an ideology too, as compared to just showing contributions that women made at the same time that men were doing this. Because during pop art, for example, there were women who were doing pop art. When photography started to be recognized as an important artistic medium, I mean, we have a photography program here as part of our fine arts. Had it not been for the work not only of the photojournalists, but women such as Cindy Sherman, when she was doing her series on B-movie posters, and she was portraying herself, these are all self-portraits, and she was showing herself how women were portrayed in all, they call them B-movies, all right? They're low-budget movies, and women are always the victims. And she did a whole series of these photographs, and it brought not only a lot of renown to her, but it was a way of focusing in with feminist issues in a way that was not necessarily someone yelling at you. All right, when you're trying to get a point across, if you come off as an angry person, male or female. It's interesting with anger, though, because if a man is angry, he's usually just angry. If a woman is angry, they call her the B word. And if you want to insult a man, call him the B word. Because then it insults his orientation, too. It's amazing how many words we have to insult women as compared to men. Matter of fact, a lot of the ones you think insult men, a lot of men think, oh, dang. That's ideology as it's played out through language. So this notion instead to show the contribution of women as part of these various artistic movements, part of these artistic schools and groups of artists. Now there are some who I really idolize because they did do the polemic, but not to denigrate men as artists or curators, but actually to go after museums as institutions. And so there was this group that was called, and it's not a music group, they're called the Guerrilla Girls. Spelled G-U-E-R-I-L-L-A. Guerrilla, like guerrilla-style warfare. And they would show up in public dressed in gorilla suits, though. No one knew who these women were. It was this kind of like secret society of women who dressed up like gorillas. And they would take out billboard ads in New York City and in Washington. And look this up online. Look up their ads. All right, they did an amazing art history book. A woman's view of art history. It's a mind-blowing art text. And they said, why is it there are no women in the Met? Why is it there are no women in the National Gallery of Art? Or that they're underrepresented? Or that while you have all this men's stuff upstairs, all the women's stuff is downstairs collecting dust? Why is it women are underrepresented? They put all of these ads out and really brought a lot of attention. But they were doing it in a humorous way. And I saw them in New York too. They were really cool. I don't know who they were. But they were putting, they during this particular time too, it's kind of like a rave. Do you know what raves are? It's like an all-night dance. They just happen, and then they're done, right? And it's agreed upon only a couple days ahead of time where it's going to happen. The word gets out, everybody gets together and parties, and then it's done. All right, and that's why this was guerrilla, because you never knew where they were going to appear, and when they were going to, it was a hit and run. But it was to emphasize the importance of women in art. And when we're looking then at the structure of knowledge, that art history, and that the museums are structured by old paradigms. You remember a paradigm is an agreed upon way of thinking about doing something, of actually doing something. It's a way of thought and it's a way of action. That's a paradigm. Right? And since the Renaissance, art history does have this Eurocentric, where Europe at the center of art history. Particularly, I mentioned it had a Florentine bias because that's where the first art texts came out of. When they started writing about artists, it was in Florence, Italy. And it was, actually the guy worked for the Medicis, and he wanted to value the Medici collection. So he wrote about the Medici artists and did these biographies of artists, and made them, and this becomes a very important way of looking at artists, because he made these artists like heroes. I'd say they were some of the first comic books. All right, the adventures of these artists. Well, they weren't like comic books, all right, but it was to be an artist, you had to suffer. You had this amazing tribulation that you had to suffer through, right, in order to become an artist, and then you finally achieved, and the Medicis, noticed you. So it's Eurocentric, it's male-centric, Florentine bias, and other artistic developments are often seen as an afterthought. Then, and also happened. It was on the periphery. And then you have this notion of fine art versus craft versus woman's work. Now, fine art was done by men. Craft was done by men and women. And then women's work was completely set aside. And when we look at how this plays out, because the job description for fine art, I think I mentioned in here, and I actually have a great example I can start with too, is that it had to be monumental. It had to stand for some really big thing. It had to be made of precious material. You couldn't use it. It had to be art for its own sake. So it was only to be appreciated for its visual, tactile, and other type of qualities, but you could not touch it, really. It had to be made by schooled men who had gone to the salons, to the colleges, to the universities, and the art schools. It had to be unique and irreplaceable. One of a kind. And when different people in the United States started to value, for example, there was an important collector who was good friends with Fred Harvey. Fred Harvey had they were like, is there still a Hojo's? Because I don't eat fast food anymore. Hojo's, Howard Johnson's. Is there still a Hojo? You ever heard of Hojo's? You ever heard of Shoney's? The restaurant, Shoney's. I don't even know if they're still around. IHOP. You've got to know IHOP, all right, International House of Pancakes, all right? This was the first of those type of tourist stores where you could eat and buy stuff, buy souvenirs and the like. Fred Harvey was an entrepreneur who had a shop set up in Albuquerque, and if you came through on the Santa Fe Railroad, you get off in Albuquerque, you could take the Indian Detour. So you were a detourist, and you would come up to the Pueblos, and then you would buy stuff from the Indians. And it was part of your adventure in the Southwest. And a lot of Indians would go to the train stations with things that were small and transportable. Because before the emergence of the railroad, when you look at Pueblo pots, they're really big ollas because you're using them. Once the railroad comes to town and people want to buy Indian stuff, the pots start to shrink. They got to be transportable. Navajos are weaving blankets, serapes, and mantas. A guy by the name of Kit Carson comes along and rounds them up, kills their sheep, and puts them on a long march. Well, he's the one who's acting on the orders. They end up at Fort Sumner, Bosque Redondo. They're there for 4 years. And they learn about calico, satin, that real velvety like this is, and other kind of cheap cloth at the time. They finally signed a treaty to be able to go back to a portion of what was their homeland, but their sheep are gone. And at the same time, the economies of all the tribes that used to trade for those blankets have been decimated by the United States. You cannot afford to buy, if you're an Indian, you cannot afford to trade for a Navajo blanket anymore. And people in the United States don't wear blankets. They may throw them on their bed, but they're going to use the machine-woven blankets. However, people in the United States, if they have disposable income, are living in homes that have hardwood floors. What do you think people in the U.S. want to put on a hardwood floor? Rugs. And there is a shift by Navajo weavers to accommodate a new market. Rugs. And they don't break when they're on a train. And for people in the United States, if they wanted a rug before then, they were getting a Persian rug. These wealthier families. Now, if you're buying a Persian rug, the person who wove the rug is getting maybe 1% of the price of that rug by the time it arrives in your Boston home. Because that rug is being taken out of the desert from that weaver, and it's changing hands several times, and then there are international tariffs that are being put on it, so that a rug that maybe someone paid for $1, by the time it hits New York in 1880, paying $150 for a rug is a lot of money. That's like $15,000. Or you can have Bessie Manygoats weave it using designs from Persian rugs, and you'll pay $15. Bessie Manygoats is a woman. The weavers in Afghanistan are men and women. But all of a sudden, these rugs become fine art. And so you have Bessie Manygoats appreciated as an artist because someone has a need to call what she's doing art. Datsalali, I might have mentioned in here, weaves baskets. This is not precious material. It's grass. Many of the same people who buy these baskets would cut this stuff down as weeds or would burn it to be able to grow grass for their cattle. It's women who are the basket makers. And so you see there is this disparity cross-culturally. Women who are appreciated as artists because there's a need to call them artists in the United States. Because of their baskets, because of their pots, because of their rugs. Navajo, yes? Pop art and appropriation art. Yeah, it started to change what fine art was. Yeah, because there were people like, because when something is standing for something monumental, there are several artists at the time, such as Andy Warhol. And one of the famous paintings he did was Campbell's Soup. Have you ever seen that? All right. Yeah, it's really cool to see. I saw it at the National Gallery. Yeah, but it's Campbell's Soup. You know, and he's holding it up as a painting as fine art. Now, how monumental is Campbell's Soup? Well, we think of it as it's mass-produced. This is that kind of tension. Because someone who owns that painting, it's the National Gallery, all right, that thing's worth millions of dollars. It's a painting of cans of soup. So pop art in particular, because what pop art is reflecting on is popular culture. And it's emerging in the same time period as the feminist movement is really gaining steam. So 60s and 70s. Yeah. And one of the things that we see too, because there were, while it had the strongest, you might say, presence in the 60s, there were people who were still doing it. There are people who are doing it now. You know, it's just not as noticeable anymore because it wasn't this in your face. You know, people are used to it now. It no longer has the novelty that it did then. So why should we study feminist curatorial practice? Because women's voices have been marginalized throughout Western history. Marginalized means pushed to the side, not heard. And this is also what we would see in academia and in museums as it relates to indigenous voices too. Most exhibits until the National Museum of the American Indian were designed by non-natives. And we're telling a non-native story about. So Indians as the subjects rather than the storytellers. And part of feminist curatorial practice then is to tell a woman's story from the viewpoint of a woman. Rather than, I mean, isn't it kind of ironic that I'm talking about feminist curatorial strategy? If we buy into the stereotype. Anyone can be feminist. You don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. So you have some of the dilemmas of representation. That should say self-representation. And, as I'd mentioned earlier, the changing professional demographics, because women are becoming much more dominant, even in the museum world. And we even see it, this is what I love about our museum here. Who's the director of the museum? Patsy Phillips. Where was she before? Yeah, National Museum of the American Indian. And you look at the staff of NMAI, they are very strongly woman-dominated. So what is feminist curation then? It is being interested in providing a more complete and balanced picture that does not denigrate the male. There is a focus, a very strong focus, on women's historic roles and their cultural experiences in art, in curation, but aren't defined by using patrilineal standards, right? In some ways, then, it's creating a space apart from patrilineal, patriarchal ways of viewing the world, because you may not necessarily be using the same standards to gauge the quality of the art, or for that matter, even the media. And the themes that are addressed. So that space apart, it doesn't mean that it is a, this is where you have to be careful, because when they were talking about segregation in the 1960s, segregation meaning separate but equal. So that, that blacks would go to schools that were different from white schools, they were separated from, but they were supposed to be equal. That is a farce. So this space apart is more of a temporal, and when I mean temporal, what occurs in our mind, not in sense of time. All right, what's going on in our thought. Trying to find another way of looking at things that aren't using male standards alone. But if you've gone to art school, you're unavoidably affected by a male-dominated institution. As far as what are the foundational, the pedagogies, the principles of teaching. So why did feminist curation emerge? That contemporary art has become a female-dominated profession. And as was noted in a quote in the beginning of the chapter, that women curators are often regarded as keepers of culture. Instead of being a housekeeper in a museum, you're now a culture keeper. But at the same time, while you're a culture keeper, a housekeeper, you're within a larger structure. So if you're a housekeeper, someone owns the house. Did that make sense? If you're a culture keeper, someone owns the cultural institution. And for a long time, those positions at the top of that hierarchy, the director of a museum, has been dominated by men. So there has been some change, but I think if we were to do a survey today of the directors of museums across the country, we'd still find that it's dominated by men. And if we were to look at comparative salaries, we would find that men are still paid more. So the curatorial practice that started to emerge is it started with women who affiliated with each other. They got organized, collaborated, and started to put on shows that featured only women artists who were parts of the same types of movements, such as pop art, such as appropriation. There were abstract expressionist artists who were women. So when you look at Jackson Pollock, you rarely hear about his wife. So you have these collaborations not only of women curators, but groups of women artists, critics, or art historians who are going to present the woman's side of the story. Because there is a lot of documentation about women's voices. There is a lot of documentation about women artists. But if the art history is being written by men, there is this tendency to see only what you're looking for. And if you're not looking for women as artists, you're not going to find it. It's amazing how many women have been a part of history that have not been regarded. As I mentioned earlier in the semester, unless you were an angry woman with a sword. So some of the challenges then have been finding enough venues to do this kind of work. And there have been many museums that were willing to support these kinds of initiatives and museum programs. But there are still issues of control and representation, that there have been discrimination against women artists. And you'll find that there are many historical collections at many major museums in which women are still the minority. And an important part of this whole dilemma, because I'm going to fast forward to actually something that's not related to women at all. I'm going to skip over that. Because in part of telling the story of people whose voices have been underrepresented, whether it be from women's viewpoints, because I'm making a connection here now to indigenous curatorial practice, because the indigenous voice in museums is not often well heard. And when it is heard, there are certain places that you are expected not to go because it makes people uncomfortable to really look at the history. And that's some of the reason, even with women's curatorial practice, it makes people uncomfortable to have to say we as a society have abused women and continue to do so with a pretty face. And for indigenous peoples, there are certain kinds of art when we're looking at putting objects that we create in a larger perspective and looking below the surface of the dominant ways of thinking. Because a lot of what American Indians produced in the late 19th century to even into the 1960s was called craft. And a category of that craft is souvenirs. So I'm going to look at souvenir as a case study of a way of looking at something that on the surface, if we just look at the way that it's been commonly looked at by historians from the outside looking in as compared to the inside looking out, that as curators, part of your research responsibility is to look for the deeper stories, what we might call deep reading, and looking beyond the surface and seeing things in a much larger picture. Because a lot of the stuff that was produced by natives during the 1700s and 1900s was influenced by Europeans and Americans for a tourist market. And this is particularly in the Northeast, because by the time we start to see the evaluation of baskets, of textiles, of ceramics by wealthy families such as William Randolph Hearst, who amassed an amazing collection of Navajo classic textiles. He's one of the reasons that Navajo weaving becomes well appreciated. He's a wealthy man. He's got a lot of money. He's buying a lot of textiles. And he's making sure people see them. Whereas when you're creating things for a souvenir market, it's a different story that's being told. Because these pin cushions, miniature canoes that our woodland tribes are using, that they're creating for sale to travelers and tourists. You've got the miniaturization. Because, you know, you're on a train, you're going to have a difficult time carrying a 12-foot birch bark canoe home with you. So you get the small ones. Little birch bark teepees, because everyone thinks all Indians lived in teepees. So you got Mohawks making teepees. And Northeastern peoples were the first to experience this whole scale economic and social marginalization, being pushed to the side, and become the first to rely on the production of commodities for tourists. Because tourism is happening in the Northeast before it's happening here. Because the national parks aren't going to be established until the 1870s and after in the West. In the East, you can go to Niagara Falls. This is a big tourist destination. There are going to be people all over the world to see this 165-foot shower. There are whole stories about going and seeing the Maid of the Mist, taking a ride on the Maid of the Mist boat, and then coming away with the souvenirs. And part of the European and Americans, because this is in Canada too. There are important places in Canada where people are going to go, such as the St. Lawrence River, which ends up out into the Great Lakes. A tea cozy from Maniwaki. This is Canada, by Euphemia Layton. Euphemia is a woman. And she's making, at the time, was considered a craft. And it's typical, what would be called women's stuff, embroidery. She's using silk thread, glass beads, red Stroud cloth, and floral designs are from native as well as introduced plant species. I promise you, you would see very few of these in the homes of Maniwaki people. A tea cozy is something you place over your tea stuff to keep the tea warm or to keep it clean, the dust off it. You didn't see many people from Maniwaki sitting there sipping their tea. Everything stops for tea. Tea and crumpets. And it's embroidery. It's a woman's craft. It's beautiful. But in the day, it's seen as a souvenir. It's not seen as fine art. But if you see this now, for example, at a Sotheby's or a Butterfield's auction, the title is going to say Native American Art. But in its day was not viewed as art. And it is a commentary about disruption of an economic lifestyle and disruption of gender roles. And an economy that has become dependent upon Canadians and Europeans and people from the United States. So what I like to do, I like to call it, you ever heard of subsistence? Indians were subsistence farmers. Hunter-gatherers bumbling from cactus to cactus and tree to tree and water hole to water hole. No, I like to call it subsistence artistry. And that tourist art is being created for tourists, for people to make a living. It's kind of like cash crops in a banana republic. A banana republic is a country that has been colonized and their economy has been subverted to produce fruit. For example, bananas to be sold by Dole, or what is it, Chiquita? Yes, Dole pineapple and Chiquita bananas, all right, but it's being exported too. Yeah, you've got one. Coffee, Juan Valdez. Chocolate. People's economies have changed. They're no longer self-sufficient. they have become dependent upon plantation owners. They're working for low wage. Their lifestyle has been changed in such a way that they are dependent upon the colonizer and the colonizing economic system. So the old lifestyles are gone, and people have to survive in a new context. And the colonizers will often speak in a diminutive way about the effects of colonization. So there's a few famous passages by Mark Twain, the American author, about his visit to Niagara Falls. And the way he describes American Indians is in no uncertain terms racist. And people will say, well, no, that was a 19th century perception. It's racist in any century. And the bad guy in Tom Sawyer, his name is Injun Joe. And the idiot in Tom Sawyer is a black man. It's a pervasive part of American culture and Canadian culture and literature of people whose lives have been disrupted by colonization. And so you'll have people who will talk about, and you'll often hear this when you go to trade shows, like when they have the ethnographic show, when they used to have it at the Armory in Santa Fe. You would hear people talk about tourist trash. I worked for a guy who had a label that he distinguished things that he bought from Navajos as tourist trash. It was considered kitsch. And that woman who made that miniature loom is doing that to feed her kids. And it's really easy for the colonizer to look and blame the people who have been colonized for the situation they find themselves in. And it's real easy to look at women and say, you're the reason we die now, because you gave us an apple 1,000,000 years ago. Outside looking in. And one of the important dilemmas, challenges in indigenous curatorial strategy is telling that other side, no matter how comfortable it is, uncomfortable it is. Because we don't learn anything by just listening to the nice stuff. So often, what we would see as tourist trash is dismissed as being inauthentic, being commoditized, impure, acculturated, and commercial, rather than the effects of an exploitive process done through colonization. Because even the notion of something being authentic or inauthentic, if you just one day you have to take the train, if you can, from Santa Fe to Albuquerque. And along that trail, there's going to be a stop. I think it's at Cochiti or San Domingo. Is it San Domingo? There is the remains of a store. And the store says, right outside, real Indians shop here. They did? Oh, shit! It was there like a couple of years ago. Dang. Oh. Uh-huh. Oh, man. Oh. I mean, that causes my heart to. Oh, that makes me so sad. I mean, it was the last place real Indians shopped. As featured in Look magazine. Larry McNeil he's an Alaska native, he got a photograph of it. That was the first time I heard of it. But he just said he was driving along in New Mexico. I didn't know where he was, but I was on the train. We drove by and I said, real Indian shop here. We're gone by. Did I just see what I actually paid for the train again in order to be able to see if I really saw the sign, and I did. And I said, wow, that's where it was. I mean, I felt like I'd enter Mecca or something. Because that's where real Indians shop. All these other places, I always said, I always wanted to put one at Walmart. Because back home, if you want to find somebody from the reserve, you go to Walmart. Right? You go to Walmart, meet your wife. All right, that's what you do. All right, that's where you go to snag, is Walmart. And that is the tail end of a colonization process. We don't look beneath the surface. And if we look at just the object rather than the other economic, social, cultural forces that shape that object as a physical manifestation of history. So a souvenir is an object that someone acquires for the memories the owner associates with it. This is only half the story. And this is the typical definition. And it's different than memorabilia, because memorabilia is, whereas a souvenir is something that is just in general, where memorabilia is connected with a specific event. All right, so I have memorabilia, for example, from the shows I saw of Led Zeppelin in the 70s and the 60s. I still have ticket stubs, Pink Floyd, all these bands now that, they're seen as classic rock. Some of them really sucked live, all right, but I got the ticket. Queen, they weren't that great live. But I still have, that's memorabilia. It's connected with a specific event. You get the T-shirt, you get the poster, and you get the ball cap or whatever, the bat at bat day at the game. That's memorabilia. As compared to souvenir, which is in general. Right? And it's going to be your memories that you associate. So if you buy that little birch bark canoe at Niagara Falls, you would take that little canoe, when we were talking about the history of museums and the curio cabinets, you would bring that little canoe home and you'd set it on the shelf so when your visitors came over you could pull the canoe off, because it'd be really hard to pull a 12-foot one out. And you'd talk about going to Niagara Falls. And this was a replica of the canoe that the Maid of the Mist drove it over the falls with. That's a souvenir. So it can be any object that's collected or purchased and then transported home by the owner. Sometimes it's called mass-produced kitsch. Kitsch means, in essence, cheaply made stuff that's sold to tourists. All right, it's cheap, it's tacky, they'll often say, and often low quality. And when you hear this term, tourist trap, that's another one of these terms, all right, that, it's a place where tourists are going to go and spend money on kitsch because of the memories. So the object itself has no real significance other than the psychological connection the possessor has with the object as a symbol of past experiences. Without the owner's input, the object's meaning is invisible and cannot be articulated. That is bullshit. Because there is someone who made that object, and they are doing so to make a living. And they might be a Chinese person chained to a desk, working for pennies on the hour, and they're 9 years old. How much of the story are people willing to tell or to hear? And this is where, as a curator, we have to expand the view of aesthetic. Because aesthetic can be ugly, too. It's still a way of understanding something. It's just another way of seeing. But what it can do is it can activate what people will often call negative emotions. You ever heard someone say you're overreacting? It drives me right out of my mind when someone says that. I'm not overreacting, I'm just reacting. It's making you uncomfortable, and you're telling me to stop. It's reacting. Yeah, that's on their part. And even then, that's just reacting. It's a reaction. It's an emotion. There are no negative or positive emotions. They just are. That's part of the human experience. And that's what I think makes the most potent exhibits, is where someone can go through and run the whole gamut. We see something and we laugh. We see something and we tear up because it touches our heart. And then we see something that really makes us a little bit indignant. We're going to remember that object or those objects because we've associated something emotional. And it does have a psychological attachment. So it's not just the souvenirs, it's the things that we curate. We activate emotions. And it's important to understand, though, that those emotions are activated on the part of the maker as a part of a historic process as they are of the buyer or the viewer. The objects themselves have a story. And even when you're in the archives and you're looking at a photograph, the person who shot that photo has a story. So looking deeper, as best we can to tell a more complete story. And I'll close with this then. A beautiful sportsman's cap from New Brunswick, Micmac.